Pedro Díaz Lanz was one of Fidel Castro's most trusted men. They had fought together in Sierra Maestra. They had celebrated the revolution's victory together. But in 1959 Fidel told him, "Pedro, you're not a communist, so you can't lead the Air Force anymore." Pedro fled to Florida. 3 months later, he returned to Havana, but this time in the pilot's seat, with a plane loaded with bombs. "Fidel," he said over the radio, "you declared me a traitor. Now you'll see what real betrayal is. What do you think? Can a military officer take revenge on his country for personal betrayal? Where is the line between patriotism and vengeance? Share your perspective in the comments. Subscribe to the channel to discover unknown secrets about Fidel Castro, and turn on notifications to learn something new every day. Dr. Pedro Luis Díaz Lanz had been commander of the Revolutionary Air Force since the first day of triumph. At 38 years old, he was one of the few high-ranking officers who had fought both in Sierra Maestra and on the urban front. His office at José Martí Airport was modest but functional. On the walls hung photographs of the revolution, him piloting supply planes to the Sierra, meetings with Fidel, military ceremonies. That morning, he received a call that would change his life forever. "Pedro, it's Fidel. I need to see you at the palace. Now. Is something wrong, Commandante? We'll talk about it." Díaz Lanz hung up the phone with a strange feeling. Fidel's tone was different, cold, distant. It wasn't the same man who had embraced him when they took Havana 6 months earlier. During the drive to the Palace of the Revolution, Pedro mentally reviewed the last few weeks. There had been tensions, disagreements about the direction of the revolution. Pedro had expressed concern about the growing communist influence in the government. He had questioned some appointments. He had suggested that Cuba should maintain balanced relations with both the United States and the Soviet Union. Had those differences reached Fidel? But the most shocking part was, in Fidel's office, Pedro found an icy atmosphere. Present were Raúl Castro, Che Guevara, and Camilo Cienfuegos. None of them greeted him with the usual warmth. "Pedro," began Fidel without preamble, "we've been evaluating the loyalty of revolutionary cadres." "Loyalty?" Pedro was surprised. "Commandante, my loyalty is beyond question. I've risked my life for this revolution. Loyalty is not measured only by the past, but by the present and the future." Che intervened. "Pedro, we've received reports about your private statements." "Statements? Problematic. What statements?" "Counter-revolutionary statements," said Raúl dryly. Pedro felt the ground move beneath his feet. "Counter-revolutionary?" "For expressing legitimate concerns about the country's direction. For questioning the decisions of revolutionary leadership," responded Fidel. "Fidel, I've known you for years. You know I'm a patriot. You know I love Cuba. If I've expressed doubts, it's because I want what's best for our country. And what is best for Cuba, in your opinion?" Pedro breathed deeply. He knew he was on dangerous ground, but decided to be honest. "A democratic system, free elections, respect for individual freedoms, balanced relations with all nations." The silence in the room was deafening. Finally, Fidel spoke. "Pedro, those ideas are incompatible with the objectives of the revolution." "What objectives?" "When we were fighting in the Sierra, we talked about democracy, freedom, social justice. And we will have social justice. But through socialism, not through bourgeois capitalism." Pedro felt his blood run cold. "Socialism? Fidel, you repeatedly denied being communist. Labels don't matter. What matters is loyalty to the revolutionary process. Just at this point everything changed. Che Guevara leaned forward. Pedro, you have a choice. You can adapt to the new reality, or you can resist it. What does it mean to adapt? It means accepting that Cuba will follow the socialist path. It means publicly supporting all government decisions. It means eliminating any contact with counter-revolutionary elements. And if I don't adapt, Raúl responded, then you'll have to step away from positions of responsibility. Pedro looked at Camilo, expecting support from his old friend. But Camilo avoided his gaze. Are you asking me to betray my principles? We're asking you to put the revolution above your bourgeois principles, said Che. My principles are not bourgeois. They're democratic. At this historical moment, intervened Fidel, bourgeois democracy is the enemy of the revolution. Pedro stood up from his chair. Fidel, do you hear yourself? 6 months ago you promised free elections. You promised a democratic constitution. Circumstances have changed. What circumstances? Soviet pressure? Communist advisors? Fidel's eyes hardened. Pedro, your attitude confirms our suspicions. You can't continue leading the Air Force. Are you removing me from my position? I'm giving you the opportunity to resign with dignity. Pedro felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The man for whom he had risked his life was expelling him for maintaining the same ideals they had shared. And if I refuse to resign, then you'll be removed for counter-revolutionary activities. Wait a moment, don't miss this detail. Pedro looked around the room. These men had been his brothers in arms. Now they treated him like an enemy. What happened to us? He asked with a breaking voice. When did we become this? We didn't become anything, responded Fidel. You stayed in the past. The past? You mean when we believed in democracy? I mean when we were naive about the reality of power. Pedro realized he was losing his old friend forever. All right, he said finally, I resign. But let it be clear, I'm not resigning because I did something wrong. I'm resigning because I no longer recognize the revolution I fought for. Your resignation is effective immediately, said Raúl. And after that, what am I supposed to do with my life? You can stay in Cuba as a private citizen, offered Fidel. No one will bother you if you keep a low profile. Low profile? Live in silence while I watch them destroy everything we fought for. Pedro, Fidel's voice softened slightly, you're my friend. I don't want anything bad to happen to you. But I also can't allow you to obstruct the revolutionary process. Pedro walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned one last time. Fidel, one day you'll regret this. One day you'll remember that we were once brothers fighting for the same cause. We were always brothers, Pedro. The problem is we now have different causes. Pedro left the palace knowing he would never be welcome there again. You still haven't seen the biggest surprise. After his resignation, Pedro tried to stay out of politics. But the regime wouldn't leave him alone. First came travel restrictions. His passport was confiscated temporarily. Then the surveillance began. Security agents followed him openly. Then pressure started on his family. His wife lost her job at the hospital. His children were marginalized at school. The final straw came on August 2nd. Pedro was summoned to declare before a revolutionary tribunal about his suspicious activities. At the tribunal, a young prosecutor accused him of maintaining contact with counter-revolutionary elements. "What elements?" asked Pedro. "People who have expressed doubts about the revolutionary process." "Is expressing doubts now a crime?" "Conspiring against the revolution certainly is." "Where is the evidence of conspiracy?" The prosecutor showed a folder. "We have testimonies from people who heard you criticize the government." Pedro read the testimonies. They were private conversations he had had with friends and family members. Conversations someone had reported to the authorities. "This is a police state," muttered Pedro. "Excuse me." "Nothing." The tribunal declared him a potentially dangerous element and ordered him placed under permanent surveillance. That night, Pedro made a desperate decision. You won't believe what happened next. Pedro had been preparing his escape for 2 weeks. As former commander of the Air Force, he knew every airport and airstrip in Cuba. His plan was simple: steal a small plane and fly to Florida. In the early morning of August 15th, Pedro arrived at the small aerodrome at Baracoa. The night guard knew him from his days as commander. "Don Pedro, what are you doing here so early?" "Surprise inspection." "Orders from Havana." The guard suspected nothing. Pedro headed to the hangar where a Cessna 180 was stored. As he prepared the plane, he thought of his family. His wife and 2 children would stay behind. He couldn't tell them anything for security reasons. At 5:30 a.m., he took off heading north. 2 hours later, he landed at Key West Airport. U.S. immigration officials were waiting for him. Someone had leaked information about his arrival. "Dr. Díaz Lanz," said an FBI agent, "welcome to the United States. How did you know I was coming?" "We have our sources. Your arrival is of great interest to us." Pedro was taken to an interrogation center where he spent 3 days answering questions about Castro's regime. "Doctor," a CIA agent told him, "you could be very valuable to us. I didn't come here to betray my country. I came to escape tyranny." "We understand. But Castro already declared you a traitor. Your reputation in Cuba is destroyed. Why not use your knowledge to help the Cuban people?" Pedro needed time to think. "When you thought everything was over." In Miami, Pedro was received by a growing community of Cuban exiles. They all had similar stories. They had initially supported the revolution but had been betrayed by the communist turn. At exile meetings, Pedro quickly became a prominent figure. His military rank and knowledge of the regime made him valuable. "Comrades," he said at the meetings, "Castro deceived us all. He promised democracy and gave us dictatorship. But some exiles wanted more than words." Pedro, a former officer named Antonio, told him, "You know the Cuban Air Force better than anyone. Isn't there a way to hit them from the air?" "Are you talking about aerial attacks?" "I'm talking about showing Castro that the opposition has teeth." Pedro struggled internally. Part of him wanted revenge against Fidel. Another part resisted attacking his own country. The decision came on September 28th, when he received devastating news from Cuba. His wife had been arrested on charges of counter-revolutionary activities. His children had been sent to a state orphanage. That night, Pedro called Antonio. "I'm ready," he said. "Ready for what?" "To show Fidel what real betrayal is." Revenge was in motion. The operation was financed by wealthy Cuban exiles and discreetly coordinated by CIA agents. The plan was apparently simple. Pedro would fly over Havana in a small plane, drop anti-Castro propaganda, and return to Florida. But Pedro had his own secret plan. "Antonio," he told the night before the flight, "if something happens to me, Tell my children that their father died fighting for freedom. Why are you talking about dying? It's just a propaganda mission." Pedro didn't respond. On October 21st at 6 a.m., Pedro took off from Opa-locka Airport in Miami in a modified Cessna 310. Officially, he was carrying 50,000 anti-Castro leaflets. Unofficially, he was carrying something more. At 2 p.m., he crossed Cuban airspace. Cuban air defense, still disorganized, didn't detect him until he was already over Havana. Pedro flew directly toward the city center. Below he could see the streets where he had walked as a revolutionary hero just a year before. He opened the first hatch and began dropping the leaflets. But then he opened the second hatch. The moment of revenge had come. Pedro had secretly modified the plane to carry 2 50-pound bombs. His original target was the Palace of the Revolution, but when he flew over the building, he saw it was surrounded by civilians. Children playing in the nearby park. Families walking on the streets. At that moment, Pedro had a crisis of conscience. Was he really going to kill innocents out of personal revenge? He diverted the plane toward a less populated area. But fuel was running low, and he needed to drop the weight. He dropped the bombs on what he thought was an empty commercial area. But he was wrong. The first bomb fell near El Encanto warehouse, killing 2 workers. The second bomb fell on a residential street, injuring 45 people, including children. Pedro heard the explosions and felt immediate horror. "My God!" he cried. "What have I done?" He tried to fly back to Florida, but fuel ran out over the Florida Strait. He had to make an emergency landing in international waters. He was rescued by the U.S. Coast Guard 3 hours later. The consequences were devastating. Fidel Castro convened an emergency press conference that same night. "Comrades," he said in front of the cameras, "today Cuba was attacked by mercenary terrorists serving imperialism. The traitor Pedro Díaz Lanz, trained and financed by the CIA, bombed innocent civilians in Havana. 2 Cuban workers have died. 45 people have been injured, including women and children. This cowardly attack demonstrates the true nature of the revolution's enemies." Images of the victims were broadcast on national television. The Cuban people, shocked, united more than ever around Fidel. "From today on," continued Fidel, "any person who collaborates with these terrorists will be considered an enemy of the people. We will establish defense committees of the revolution in every neighborhood to protect us from future aggression. And we tell Pedro Díaz Lanz and his imperialist masters, Cuba does not surrender. Cuba resists. Cuba wins." The popular reaction was immediate. Thousands of Cubans took to the streets to condemn the attack. Pedro had achieved exactly the opposite of what he wanted. Instead of weakening Fidel, he had strengthened him. Pedro was transferred to a Miami hospital for medical treatment and interrogation. The CIA agents who visited him were not pleased. "Pedro, what the hell did you do? It was supposed to be just propaganda. I changed the plan. I wanted to hit Fidel directly. And instead you killed innocent workers. It was an accident. That wasn't my target." "An accident? You carried bombs without authorization." Pedro broke down. "I wanted revenge. I wanted Fidel to feel what I felt when he betrayed me." "Well, congratulations. You just gave him the best propaganda he could ask for." Pedro realized the magnitude of his error. His impulsive action had helped consolidate the regime he was trying to overthrow. Pedro Díaz Lanz lived the rest of his life in exile in Miami. He never piloted a military plane again. He became a civilian flight instructor and occasionally gave interviews about the Cuban Revolution. In 1987, a journalist asked him if he regretted the bombing. "I regret killing innocent people," he answered. "That wasn't my target." "But do you regret attacking Castro?" "No. Fidel betrayed the revolution. He betrayed Cuba. He betrayed everyone who fought for freedom." "Would you do the same thing again?" Pedro thought for a long time before responding. "Next time, I would be more careful with my targets." Pedro Díaz Lanz died in Miami in 2008, at age 87. He never returned to Cuba. Fidel Castro died in 2016, having ruled Cuba for 47 years after the bombing. Pedro Díaz Lanz's bombing marked a before and after in the Cuban Revolution. Before the attack, there was still room for internal opposition. After the attack, any form of dissent was equated with terrorism. Pedro wanted personal revenge and got a national tragedy. Fidel wanted to consolidate power and got the perfect justification. The only losers were the innocent civilians who died in the bombing and the millions of Cubans who lost forever the possibility of a peaceful democratic transition. Sometimes, acts of personal revenge end up destroying the very causes they intend to defend. On October 21, 1959, a betrayed man became a traitor. Pedro Díaz Lanz, former commander of the Revolutionary Air Force, bombed Havana to take revenge on Fidel Castro. He killed 2 innocents, injured 45, and gave Fidel the perfect excuse to establish a police state. Personal revenge became national tragedy, and the Cuban Revolution lost forever the possibility of being democratic. If this story of betrayal and revenge impacted you, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell for more explosive episodes of Cuban history. What will be the next secret we reveal?